So let's start talking a little bit about Chinese art of roughly the same period that we've been looking at. We focus on really quite a few artists to tell our story, although you helped to complicate that by all the different artists that you introduced in your tutorial presentations. I want to make a leap to a very different cultural situation in order to relativize the discussion we've been having so far. Because so often when art history of this period is told, it is told as a European story. And I think at this point in art history, we really need to stop thinking about art in distinct cultural tradition boxes. We need to understand that there is a whole world out there where art is being made, and that one can't construct a narrative of modernity that only talks about one civilization and constructs the difference between the art of that civilization and that of others as being simply due to, the other ones haven't caught up yet. That's really not the case, I think. One needs to understand the art of each culture more on its own terms. So I think it's necessary for us to have a certain amount of cultural relativity in our approach to art history nowadays. And of course, students studying in Hong Kong are very, very well placed to be at the forefront of such approaches to art history. Already, almost inevitably, you have a foot in more than one cultural tradition. So I think it's not just about saying, we should study Chinese art as a separate topic. It's about mapping these topics onto one another, or seeing all this art is occurring in the same space in some sense. Modernity is something that all different cultures have faced, and it's the same thing. Already the economies of different countries have become linked together. When there was an industrial revolution in England and the mechanization of spinning and weaving, well, that had implications for handloom weavers in India, pretty directly, one would imagine. Their markets were affected. So modernity is the same thing in different cultures. It may be different ends of the same stick, as it were, but it is the same stick. Vision in crisis, we're talking about this idea of relativity, that art is discovering there is more than one way of representing things. And part of that has been the discovery of other cultures. And certainly in China, that was a big part of the story, the discovery, particularly of Western modes of image making, or not really discovery. Of course, those modes of Western image making were known in China, for example, at the court in Beijing in earlier centuries. But I think by the 20th century, you start to see them having a different kind of status, as being considered as valid modes for high art and not just as some tool for artisans. It's a more fundamental challenge that it seems to offer. And I think we see that challenge is there, not just for those artists who end up using Western style art, but also for those artists who end up using ink painting. Sometimes when people talk about Chinese art of the early 20th century, they make a sort of sharp distinction between reformists and traditionalists, but I don't find that very helpful at all. I mean, I think that many artists who are thought of as traditionalists are actually, if you look more closely at them, are reformists themselves. They're trying very hard to change the approach of earlier art. They just are choosing to do so using ink rather than oil paint. That doesn't make them traditionalists, and it's difficult to make use of Western influences in modern Chinese art, but actually it's just as difficult to make use of the Chinese past as well. The past is just as other as other cultures are, just as difficult to know what use you should make of it in your own time and place. So there's just as much disruption and discontinuity, I would say, in ink painting as there is in the art which uses oil. Well, of course, this theme of a big theme for the 20th century in China as in other places is nationalism. A lot of the art made in that early part of the century and even later, actually, is inspired by national goals. It wants to speak to spectators in their role as national subjects. Of course, that is an identity that didn't even exist in the imperial era. People didn't conceive of themselves as citizens at that time. So it's by definition a new thing, but it's a new role for Chinese art, which is primarily something that was disseminated in private spaces. Suddenly art had a public role. So it's not just the styles of art that were changing, it's the whole way in which art education was done, it's the whole situation in which art was exhibited and talked about. It's published in a magazine, it's talked about in a magazine, in a public site, in other words. It's hanging in an exhibition, a public exhibition. Even a palace, even the palace in Beijing becomes a museum. That's a sort of symbol of a transformation from private to public in a sense. Sometimes nationalism, it's hard to talk about the phenomenon of nationalism in art in China. One reason is that nationalist thinking is not just there in the art, it also infects how art history is written. People often write in a nationalistic way. So the virus is spread through the very system you're using to, the virus is there in the medicine that you're trying to treat it with. That makes it a very complicated thing. So sometimes people feel they have to defend Chinese art against the suggestion that there are foreign influences, because somehow that would undermine the national differentness of that art. But I don't see it that way at all. I would say that it's manifestly the case that there were a lot of Western influences in early 20th century Chinese art. I don't think it's just undeniable that culturally and in many other ways China looked to the West because of the history of imperialism. Apart from anything else, they used tools of the West to resist the West as much as anything else. But to say that someone has taken something from elsewhere isn't to denigrate what they're doing, because it's the person doing the taking who is taking the active role in that situation. Sometimes the word we use in art history about influence, it sort of implies that the person being influenced is passive in the process, but of course the actuality of that is it's the person who chooses to, when Seurat chooses to look at Piero della Francesca, that's something Seurat as an active agent was involved in. It's not something Piero did to him. Piero had been dead for centuries after all. So the same is true with how Western art was used in 20th century China. Sometimes people talk about it as Western art, but of course in the West there's no such category as Western style art. It doesn't exist. It only has a meaning in that kind of context. So obviously one of the most important early sites for this kind of encounter with the foreign was Shanghai, and it's not just as a port city encountering other cultures. It's also a site of capitalism. I think that's what we want to talk about in a way. If you want to look at an objective basis of modernity, that would be the development of capitalist economies. I've also, in this course, I've tried to emphasize the conceptual side of modernity as a feeling of relativity, a feeling that the culture that you've inherited is just one amongst many, that one has to make conscious choices about style in art. There is no given style anymore. You know, if you like Wu Chang Shuo, you may use ink painting, but you're using it as a conscious choice. You know, you're starting to be aware that there are other different idioms, even at the level of your audience. Your audience is an international one. You know, he and other artists of Shanghai of his time are selling works to Japanese buyers who are very present in Shanghai, even as pupils of some of the Chinese artists there. Sometimes Japanese audiences are very important for, you know, advancing the reputation. For Shibaisha, for instance, that was the case. Japan is of interest in itself. Sometimes you're getting elements of Japanese cultural influence, but sometimes it's Japan as a kind of distorted mirror of Chinese culture, and very often it's Japan as a source of information about the West, an easier, close at hand way to just discover about Western art in another Asian civilization that consciously had been trying to learn from the West for many decades. So here is Wu Chang Shuo's Peony Narcissus Rock, 1889. Very, very pared down, very, very simplified composition, so often the case with him. He's really, really influenced by, is a good calligrapher and really influenced by calligraphy even in his painting brushstrokes. Talking about this sense of audience, I think he's part of a trend towards a more accessible subject matter, instead of very elite, learned subjects. Subject matter starts to become more accessible. He himself is very learned, but his art becomes more easily accessible to a wider, maybe middle-class audience. You know, the art is much more frequently being mediated by the marketplace. So you can buy it in an art shop. It's not about a personal relationship between the artist and the collector necessarily. It could have a slightly more anonymous quality about it that the capitalist marketplace allows, especially in a big city like Shanghai. So movement more from landscape, the dominant subject of the Terati style painting, towards well, in this case, flowers. So the more accessible subject, color becoming more important. So a very simplistic view of this kind of art would be to see it as very traditionalistic. You know, where are all the great it's made in it really very much the year of post-impressionism, 1889. But of course it doesn't need to break with the Renaissance tradition, because in China there's no equivalent to that kind of mimetic, illusionistic tradition. It's always been the case that one can be aware of brushwork as brushwork. So there wasn't the same kind of target to break down that tradition that the post-impressionists and later the cubists felt. So naturally the form modernity will take will be very different. In an image like this, you see a rock, but you also see an ink wash. You know, you see form and you see content. There's no problem about that. Maybe he's pushing it in a slightly modernistic way, but it's not sort of completely out of touch with what tradition already allows. He's exacerbating tradition rather than breaking with tradition. You don't have in Chinese art the obsession with one-point perspective. Say in a hand scroll, you've got the multiplicity of perspectives brought together. So even what Cubism offers is really not needed. So modernity will be there, but it may take quite different stylistic forms. Shibaisha, quite similar in certain ways, the same kind of economy and same kind of subject matter: birds, insects, flowers, more accessible subject matter. Even some non-Asian buyers buying his work, because it's accessible enough to them. It's art in an international arena. From a different kind of social background to Wu Chuanxuo, he's coming from a more humble background, training in a sort of artisan way. And that something of that kind of folk flavour comes through in his later work, I think. This is a sort of subject a particular subject he comes back to a number of times: the eagle and pine tree. We don't have a date, but it's possibly a wartime scene. Some of the scenes of this subject date to wartime. Maybe some visual verbal pun between eagle and hero. The hero stands alone. Very extended verticality. Well, vertical formats are common in his work, but here it's particularly extended. I think the brushstrokes that make up the pine tree would be obviously made in a top to bottom direction, but the motif of the pine tree, I read it as a kind of vertical motif, and then the writing I read as a going down, falling motif, rising and falling. The pine tree turns a little bit at the top to the left, but the eagle turns to the right. They sort of counterpoise each other. It's kind of common in his paintings. You get different degrees of detail in between the eagle and the pine tree, which is done in this very, very summary, spontaneous brushwork. Very energetic brushwork. There's a lot of the artist there, an expressive kind of quality. You're very aware of the materials themselves, as you would be in Western modernist art of that time. You see the individual brushstrokes, but at the same time, you have a strong sense of the actual texture of a pine trunk. There is information about the world conveyed. So it's a little bit like that rock that looks like you see as a rock and you see as an ink wash in the Wu Chuanxuo painting. Here you're seeing the brushstrokes, you're seeing the ink, but you're also seeing the pine tree. And there's no contradiction, as there would be in a more realist idiom. So what we're looking at is artists who have tried to reform ink painting more or less on its own terms. The simplification, or even just the sort of the energy of it, is very much a kind of attempt to revitalize. Another artist whose life sort of continues into the second half of the century, Huang Binhong, similar kind of person in a way, although his style is different. He's also, I think, trying to create a great sense of vitality in the brushwork. I think I would want to see this as part of a kind of meaning of national revitalization in a way, trying to bring back, he speaks against the four Wangs as being artists who have produced art that is lost its energy, a sense that Chinese culture is becoming deadened and needs to be revitalized. In part, this is an internalization of attitudes that other cultures had about China. So in his works you see an attempt to emphasize organic unity of the whole image at the expense of naturalistic detail. What he didn't like about the Four Huangs, he says, is the way that their landscapes looked like a pile of rocks put together. You know, they didn't seem unified. So organic qualities, unity, but a dynamic unity seemed to be what he sought, of balancing the empty spaces with the solid, or breaking the solid down so that the solids breathe, have a kind of movement in them. Because all of these things are there already as resources within the Chinese painting tradition, but it's just a matter of emphasizing in certain ways. So it can be a little bit hard to see what exactly is so novel about it, but I think the novelty is there. Just looking at some album leaves by him here. Whereas so many Western artists have their breakthrough, modern Western artists have their breakthrough as a young artist. In Wang Binghong's case, it's his late work that is perhaps most original. There isn't such a rush to having originality. Well, just following other artists through who also, from later periods of the century, also just want to work within an ink painting tradition, but to see whether they can't revitalize it on its more or less on its own terms. Pan-Tian-Shou would be a good example. It's ink painting, but you know, there are things that he's taken from looking at Western art. I mean, in his very early years, he apparently practiced using Western medium. Wang Binghong was aware of Impressionism, and you know, his friends will talk about how the sort of Doty-like treatment of forms in his paintings might have some resonance with that. He himself shows that he knows what's going on in the West, but he sees it as comparable in some way, but he doesn't feel he needs to use its mediums or imitate the look of it. So it's ink painting very much made in an awareness that ink is a choice amongst possible idioms. Same for Pan-Tian-Shou. He, like other later ink painters such as Li Keran, have tried out Western medium. They know from personal experience what it can do. Or even the sort of the rather geometrical treatment of the rock. I think that's something that maybe is something that's come from looking at other modes of ink painting. Of course, a great source of revitalization is looking back within Chinese culture, and it's such a rich visual tradition that you can use that tradition against itself. So this was a time when many artists were rediscovering the work of Bada Shanren and Shi Tao. So I think Bada particularly important for this artist, for Pan-Tian-Shou. You know, the bird theme, of course, comes from that, and just the raw, the pared down quality of his paintings. So those sort of outsider artists their reputation suddenly really grows in the early 20th century, partly because of Japanese interest and scholarship. One artist who was very interested in Shi Tao, for instance, is this one, Fu Baoshi. Landscape inspired by a poem of Shi Tao, so 1945. So it's just some evidence, even in the title of the work, of his interest in Shi Tao. So even his name that he's taken, Baoshi, could mean, one meaning of that would be to cherish Shi Tao. That's one possible kind of, you know, he's named himself after him, as it were. So looking to these more individual, spontaneous artists who were a little bit outside of their time, a little bit kind of semi-detached, has been caught between the end of one dynasty and another, as having resources that you could use. So it's not a question of just sort of fitting in a great seamless tradition and being the next person in that tradition. It's about attacking dominant tendencies and finding new resources. Traditionalism is a sort of modern phenomenon in a way, the retreat to tradition. Just to say, in a different arena, religious fundamentalism is a sort of modern phenomenon. You didn't have fundamentalism until you had modernity, and then you had a kind of retreat from it in religious terms. So a traditionalist is someone who's sort of trying to sort of fight back against modernity in some sense. Fubashi, an artist who studied in Japan, so it's another part of this really big story of what you can learn from Japan. So he's picking up certain Japanese traits of ink painting. He keeps this all the way through. He lives through into the Maoist era, and even in that era, he keeps some of this sort of energetic quality of his brushstroke, even though he has to engage with the required modern subject matter. I think there's a certain vitality to it. And I think during that whole era, ink painting still had a lot of possibilities for artistic expression, whereas oil painting in the Maoist era often is deadly boring, and it just is purely in the service of state ideology, which itself is dull and innately authoritarian against the liberty of individuals, really. So, but ink painting, maybe because already that expressionistic quality is so much there in the tradition of Chinese brushwork, the brushstroke as the expression of individual mood and character, that it's hard to kind of get rid of it. So there's a sort of residual individualism almost at the level of the technique itself that can't really be gotten rid of. There's much more personality of an artist in an image like this than there is in all those countless boring images of wonderful harvests and smiling peasant faces and all this kind of thing. One could even go so far as to suggest whether there's something, almost a sort of subversive dimension in Fubashi, a sort of resistance of the dominant ideology. He made Chu Yuan a kind of national symbol. I'm saying nationalism is really so very important in the art of this time. He's a sort of national hero figure. He started using this during the period of the anti-Japanese war when he's living in Chongqing. But this particular painting is from 1953, so he's still using this in the period of the new society where everything is supposed to be okay now, but he's showing a figure resisting the state, and he's going to commit a noble act of suicide. Many other artists have represented Chu Yuan, but not so often that they show the implication is the moment just before his suicide. That moment is not so commonly shown. So there's something a little bit ambivalent about choosing such a subject at such a time, potentially negative connotations. There could be a slippage between critiquing the past and it being read as a critique of the present. Image of resistance, noble resistance. there are other kinds of artists who are using ink painting, but not so much in the sense of the artists I've already been looking at as artists who want to use it to revitalize it on its own terms. I'm thinking of the Cantonese Lingnan school artists in particular, and the most important amongst them, this artist Gao Junfu, who use ink, but very much in a consciously westernizing style. They're taking the lessons of perspective and of modeling from Western art, using it within ink painting. So their ink painting looks really very different from those artists we've already looked at. You know, with Fu Baoshe, there's a lovely use of wash and mixing of dry and wet brushstrokes and so forth. But in Gao Junfu's work, you rarely have much interest in the actual brushwork itself. At the level of the brushwork, it's often a bit dull because the brushwork is so much more in the service of describing a particular image. This one of the pumpkin is perhaps a better example for showing you using ink to create modeling, you know, the solidity of the form of the pumpkin. That's not imaginable without Western art and its influence. Again, mediated by his time spent in Japan. Japan is so important in this respect. Flying in the Rain, 1932. I think it's a good example of showing you how national subject matter becomes important. The whole address is to the audience as a national citizen. And through so many of these years, it's a time of conflict, the anti-Japanese conflict. So, you know, nationalist themes are tinged with that sense of national crisis and danger. Aviation was a particular interest for Sun Yat-sen, and Gao Junfu was his follower. He had actually a political revolutionary, not just a artistic revolutionary. I mean, a bomb-throwing type of anti-Qing revolutionary sent back to Canton to take part in that struggle from Japan, where Sun Yat-sen had been. But after the revolution was successful, he refuses high office in the new Republican era and focuses more on his art. But when he first exhibited this work in the exhibition, they have a slogan on the wall for giving Sun Yat-sen's slogan about aviation can save the country and so forth. So it's a public address. It's not that it's art that is addressed to a public that already exists. It's because the Republic is a new thing. It's actually trying to bring a public into existence through the artworks itself. Culture is a major means through which people gain a sense of themselves as being a people. So it's a particularly difficult job. It's not addressing to an audience that already exists. It's about bringing that audience into being, making people feel they are citizens, constructing a sense of identity for them. So using these kind of Western means and using modern subjects like the biplanes, which you'd never find in a Huang Binghong painting, say, but he's pushed the planes quite a way back in the space of the painting because it's potentially very disruptive. There's a kind of problem here that if you use too much modern subjects like that, or you use too much Western influences of style, you could end up producing a work which doesn't feel it has a connection with the Chinese ink painting tradition, and then it'll start to feel a bit funny somehow, a bit odd. So I think pushing the planes into the background, still it seems to belong to the tradition of Chinese landscape painting. while still having a modern subject. So there's a certain sort of tentativeness about it that I think comes from that conflict. And sometimes he's willing to try a very, the very modern, head-on approach to dealing with sort of subject you might not find in earlier Chinese art. But a lot of the time, the Ningnan school artists are just trying to give you a allegorical representation of modern life, maybe through a symbolic image of an animal symbolizing the China or something, a tiger, say. And inscriptions help to specify those national meanings. This is very difficult, I mean, even today, Sotheby's and Christie's auctions full of modern Chinese art, but people would still want to buy things to put on their walls that are more auspicious and upbeat, that fit their feng shui master's recommendations and all this sort of thing, rather than some skulls. It's not what art is often meant to do, even in modern China. This is another work which sums up these kind of problems. A Chinese City in Ruins, around 1937. So it's a work from the anti-Japanese war, the beginning of it, and showing the results of the Japanese bombing in Shanghai. A city in ruins. Okay, that's a very new kind of subject for ink painting. There isn't really a precedent for that. So there's something very modern, but you can see how he's felt worried about how that modernity could disrupt your sense of it as a Chinese ink painting. So the forms of the ruined buildings have been arranged almost like the forms of the mountains in a Chinese painting, and that the dust and smoke of the bombing becomes like the kind of the mist in the mountains of a dynastic era Chinese landscape painting. So he's doing things which kind of make the work seem related to tradition, not too disruptive of the established paradigm. But in the process of doing so, that works against his being able to convey the modern meaning, and that it's about how terrible the war is, or how terrible Japan is, if you like. But those meanings are somehow sit rather oddly with the kind of misty mountain association that he's given to the ruined city. It's an odd kind of bringing together of quite different associations. But I think it's because of this worry about the loss of a sense of the past. And then, of course, there are the artists who wanted to abandon ink altogether and see the possibilities of Western mediums. So Xu Beihong would be one of the main examples, traveling to Paris to learn a French academic style. Actually, what is conservative in the French context? I mean, this is a good example of the importance of taking a culturally relativist view. What is conservative in the French context, academic realism of a sort, could actually be more radical in the Chinese context, where realism had been less explored as a mode. So it's not necessarily in that context going to be a kind of conservative force. It might actually be a revitalizing force. Certainly that's what Xu Beihong would have thought himself. He's inspired by the ideas of Kang Yaowei thinking that Chinese art had somehow lost its energy, that the great time of Chinese art was back in the Song, when people were working in a more realistic manner before the literati spoiled everything. So maybe one could learn from Western art to go back to revitalize Chinese art. So it's under the influence of Kang Yaowei, who himself had to live in exile as one of the reformers of the Qing, who had to escape to save his life. I mean, very clearly he's learnt, this is one of the drawings made while he was in France, and he's learnt, you know, that he's a perfect student, learning anatomical skills, modelling. He even has work shown in the Salon exhibition, although by that point in time it's a very conservative affair. And I think what a lot of artists who studied overseas, even up till now, find is that going overseas is the easy part. You know, what is difficult is when because you just immerse yourself in the new environment. It's like diving into a swimming pool. You know, just get wet and splash around. It's fun. But the difficult thing is when you come back home and then you have to try and put together what you learnt overseas. What actually will be useful in my own cultural environment? What actually can I make use of? And for your study, there is a nicely decided route you can follow. You just do what all the other students are doing. You follow it like a train along a railway track. Everything is set out for you how to study. But there's no such track when you get back home to tell you how to apply French art to the situation of developing a Chinese national art that hasn't existed before. You know, you're all completely on your own about how you're going to do that. So this is a kind of thing that he did, trying to create a sort of national art. Tien Hang and his 500 retainers, 1928 to 1930. So the story being Tien Hang is being summoned by the Han Emperor, and he shows his resistance by committing suicide to save his followers, or they also die as well. So he's just bidding farewell to them. So multi-figured painting, history painting you can call it. That's a dominant genre of academic painting in the West, and he studied in the Louvre as much as he studied from life models. This is like David, you know, making paintings about Roman history or something like that. That will be the model. But it's really compositionally, it's not as severely structured as the David. You know, the figures carefully compartmentalized against the architecture, focus on the dramatic moment. I don't see a focus on the dramatic moment in quite the same way here. Compositionally, it's much less interesting. Actually, a lot of group portraits are difficult to compose. So many faces, each of one seems to be a portrait. How are they organized? Are they organized well? I'm not so sure myself that they are. He's a good portraitist. He's good at painting individual human figures, and he's good at making portraits. But I don't think he sort of dramatized the scene that well here. Of course, other people may have a different view. Very well known for his ink paintings of horses. I think following on the Lingnan school, the idea of using an animal as a national symbol. Well, there's something of the Western volumetric sense in the horse. I'm not a big fan of them. I like some of his ink paintings. This is one that I quite like. So this is the Spring Rain on the Lee River, 1937. And this is an interesting thing too. You can't really find an equivalent to this in Western art at the time, despite the kind of interest in other styles of art, other cultures, artistic traditions that Matisse, Picasso, Gauguin, Van Gogh and others had. You don't find an artist working in two very different idioms, sometimes even in the same time. But in Chinese art, you will find that. You'll find someone making ink painting and making oil paintings in really quite different idioms. So a question comes up with Xu Beihong, to what extent you can talk about them the ink paintings as being part of a same coherent vision as the oil paintings. Maybe you can with the horse paintings, but I don't find a painting like this. I like it, but I like it because of its poetic dimensions, which to me depart a bit from the realist vision that he was espousing. His whole project was about realism can revitalize Chinese art and develop a national art. But I think he's abandoning that to some extent. There isn't the volumetric representation and so forth of his other art. Whether you can see this as a response in the face of warfare, to go back to ink painting, it's harder to get Western drawing painting materials at a certain point once war starts, but it's also a sort of nationalistic retreat, maybe. Is it a coherent artistic output, or is there a sort of shift going on? Yu Hai-su, he's more willing to accept modernism in the West than Xu Beihong. A lot of images of architecture. This is Beijing's Tiananmen in 1922, or he travelled to Paris in 1930. This work, the Notre Dame in Paris. Of course, painting the facade of a cathedral like this makes us think of Monet's Rouen Cathedral facade. He's looking at Impressionist and post-Impressionist art, and that's a real big inspiration for him. Although I think you have to say that the subject may superficially be similar, but actually at another level it's quite different, because you look at Monet's Rouen Cathedral facade, it's about a dematerialization of the solid form, and that's not something that is happening here. Even during the Maoist years, he's continuing to produce oil paintings that show influence of Western modernism to some extent. So here's one called Prosperous Shanghai from 1964, taken from a very popular viewpoint on the Shanghai Bund. And clearly it's fitting the ideology of its time to show Shanghai as a bustling port and site of industry. It's a programmatic positive meaning that has to be required of art during that time. But he's also using something of the style of Van Gogh. I think you see the way the sun and the sky is treated as Van Gogh's brushwork particularly. It's Van Gogh's style, but not Van Gogh's mood or meaning or expressivity. It's using Van Gogh's style for a very un-Van Gogh-like purpose, the promotion of state ideology. Well, yeah, it's nationalism is a theme all the way through in Chinese art, but by this era the state is defining what the themes of nationalist art should be. It's not artists tentatively themselves trying to decide how can we fashion a national sense. He's also, like Xu Beihong, using ink as well as oil. Some of his ink paintings, early and late, have a feel of Zhang Daqian's approach to painting. And he's the only artist who will talk about in this whole course so far that I've actually met. He came to the main building of the Hong Kong U one time. Towards the, as you see, he's in a wheelchair. It's towards the very end of his life. I don't know. I can't remember anymore. But it was some time ago, because you can tell my hair is not so grey. And in Fangmier, third of this sort of trio of most pioneering Western media artists in early 20th century China, and probably the most adventurous in terms of engagement with Western modernism. Whereas Liu Haisu was willing to look to post-impressionism, Lin Fengmian was willing to look to expressionism, to Matisse, to Modigliani. Such a sad story in a way that so many of the important works of early 20th century Chinese art don't exist anymore just because of the vicissitudes of life and warfare and revolution. So many of his works were destroyed during the anti-Japanese war, and others were destroyed by him himself in the Cultural Revolution to try and avoid trouble coming his way, although it did come his way anyway. So Groping, 1923. I think it exemplifies some of the difficulties an artist is facing. He's trying to talk about culture's role in human progress, and that's, if you like, a sort of national meaning. But oddly, the figures that represent that are Western figures. Like, I think maybe this is Tolstoy, maybe this is Victor Hugo. There are different kind of great figures of culture. This fits very much the mood of the May 4th movement. In the early 20th century, the sense that culture is at the forefront of revitalizing civilization. Maybe in the middle of the century, from 1949, this is a very simplistic picture of Chinese history. You say in the early part of the century, culture is at the forefront of changing society. From 1949, politics is in the forefront, in the driving seat. And then since the era of Deng Xiaoping, economics is in the forefront. Of course, that's a very, very oversimplified picture. But certainly that was the mood of the time, that culture should revitalize the nation. Cai Yunpei was the thinker who most influenced him in that way. They knew each other. Great educational reformer, and Lin Fengmian spent so much of his life in education, his earlier parts of his life, in art education, as a great pioneer of Chinese art education. And as I said earlier on, changing the whole system of art. It's not just the styles that are changing, but the whole system, learning by studying from a life model in a classroom. It's such a different situation from learning on a one-to-one basis from your master, something like that. Using the Western theme of the nude for some Chinese national meaning in this work, Suffering, 1929. Again, it's a work that was destroyed. We only know it from these rather poor black and white reproductions from contemporary periodicals. So it's difficult using something so foreign to convey national meanings. It's not an easy project that you're engaged in. The nude was a difficult subject for a lot of people. And this is the nude not as an erotic, pleasing kind of subject, but to convey a sense of suffering. Something to do with the contemporary events in China. Sometimes even looking towards Cubism. A work like this, Exercise, from 1934 or possibly earlier. It was one of the few ones reproduced in colour. So the original we don't have anymore. And then his later work, post-war work, can actually seem more Chinese in a way. Like he's deliberately emphasizing the Asian features of the model. That introduces a sense of being Chinese to counterbalance the sense of it being rather like a Modigliani painting. So it somehow you're feeling this kind of worry of maybe it looks too Western. I've got to find ways to make it a bit more Chinese. So saturating the subject matter with Chineseness kind of gets rid of the Westernness of the whole subject of the nude. And whereas his early works are really addressed to a national spectator, talking to you in a sort of loud voice as a collectivity, the later works are more addressed to a private individual person. It's just you and her. It's a sort of domestic, private setting. One imagines the painting is going on the wall of a private home as well, rather than going in an exhibition of national art or something like that for the crowds to come and see and talk about. So it's still Matisse, Modigliani, other influences. I think he makes quite a good blurring between Chinese and Western modes, but partly because he's often using water-based medium, gouache, say. So sometimes he can introduce references to the great Chinese landscape tradition. Other times it's slightly more Western, but he doesn't keep the two in separate boxes like Xu Beihong does. Xu Beihong is almost like schizophrenic in his here's my ink paintings, here's my oil paintings, but with Infamien you don't get that separation. He happily brings things together. Well, there are a great many other artists of this time, and we don't have time to look at them. I just show one work by one of them, Pang Xunqin, one of the many modernist artists in Shanghai, also Paris trained, like Lin Fengmian and Xu Beihong. And so this is a whole story that comes to an end because of the Civil War and then revolution that followed and the imposition of a certain realist style. So where this, it's a sort of idle question in a sense, but where would this modernism have gone? Could it have developed to a more mature phase? Really, it's only outside of mainland China that you see that development occurring in the later phase, with the post-war period artists like Zhao Wuji. This is his Wind of 1954. It's one of the pupils of Lin Fengmian in Hangzhou Art Academy, who went to Paris and had his career there as one of the artists who created abstract expressionism and its European counterpart. Hard to imagine an abstract art like this without Chinese calligraphy and so forth. Yeah, sure. Chinese art has enabled a route towards abstraction, or abstraction has given him a space where he can engage with the tradition without being captured by it. So this is a different story, a story of exiles or artists in Hong Kong and in Taipei who are outside the People's Republic and therefore able to experiment, engage with modernism. Here's the Hong Kong artist Lu Shoukun, his Zhuangzi of 1974. So in the post-war era, somehow it becomes a little bit easier to engage with international art, with Western art, because that art itself has become more interested in Asian art and thought. So suddenly the difference between the cultures are not so great that they seemed before. Still, there's a kind of balancing act going on. On the one hand, he's referencing Zhuangzi's idea of the butterfly, dream of a butterfly, but at the same time he's referencing abstract art of Europe of that time. So it's still, even at this point, not entirely easy to digest foreign influences within a Chinese modern art. Okay, I think we better stop there at that point. So thank you very much, and I look forward to reading your essays.